going to get started here. Welcome, everyone. All right. Thank you for being here for today's lecture, part of our CED lecture series. Our speaker this afternoon is Matt Cherry. He's the Director of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design at Aeck Sargent. Great firm in Atlanta, multidisciplinary firm that does a lot of excellent work, including some local projects here on campus and throughout the Southeast. So Matt is one of our own. He graduated here with his BLA, kind of overlapping with many of us, I think, in the room at some point that were also here at UGA at the time. He went on to University of Michigan and got his master's in urban design at University of Michigan. And what else? He's past president of the Georgia ASLA a couple of years ago, leading our local professional organization. And he's a licensed landscape architect in 3 states. In addition to that, Matt is an accomplished musician, plays guitar with his rock band Maserati, and he's a legit rock star. We're glad to have you back in Athens. Good. Welcome.
All right. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Thanks, you all. I'm fully embarrassed now, so that's good. Icebreaker, I guess. So I'm Matt Cherry, and so I was going to tell you about me, but you already stole the thunder, so I'm just going to, but I'll still go through some of it. Our company, Aeck Sargent, we're in Atlanta. It's really nice to be back here. Wanted to shout out thanks to Alfie and Sonia Hurt and Ashley Steffens for helping kind of put this together. It's really nice to see y'all. My career path, because it sort of helps build, helps you understand kind of where I'm coming from in terms of design. I did BLA. I worked for TSW Design for a minute in Atlanta back in the early 2000s, and then I got a weird hair in me and decided I needed to sow my wild oats or something, so then I decided to go on tour for a couple of years with my band. I'm only bringing that up because when I think about the design process, I think it's remarkably similar to the music making and songwriting process, and I think that there's a lot of parallels and symbiosis between those things, and so I used some examples of that. I went to Michigan for urban design. I worked for a company called Urban Collage, and when I came back, and then now I work for Aeck Sargent, so sort of my life. And LAS, for those of you who don't know, we're kind of a mid-sized firm. Like, we're not boutique, but we're not like huge corporate. We don't do any engineering by design, don't want to. We do urban design, architecture, landscape architecture for historic preservation, and our company is very not siloed, almost to a fault sometimes, to be honest, but it's very mixed up, like a jambalaya. And in our actual studio, it's about 17 people. It is not just landscape architecture, it is planners, architects, landscape architects, and urban designers. Some with multiple degrees, some with 1 degree, but we all sit together and we all collaborate together, and we kind of pull skill sets in as we need for projects. So what I want to talk about is the design process. I think it's interesting, we talk about this in our studio a lot, to kind of pull the curtain back on how you approach a design problem. And it's sort of this enigmatic thing, I think. And I feel like when I was in school, I never really understood it until way later, and it took me a while to kind of figure it out. And so when I think about the design process, there are different things I'm going to touch on. Thinking about it, finding inspiration, questioning the scope. We talked about this in Pardue's class earlier today, actually. The design process is messy. The design process is just messy. So it just is. So that's the way it is. I think we're storytellers, and I think storytelling is really important. What to do when you get stuck, and then embracing iteration. So I'm gonna walk over here because I feel like I'm crunched right there. So when somebody gives you a design problem, what's the first thing that you do? Anyone? Research. That's exactly right. I mean, that's what I do. For me, for me, design is 90% thinking about it and 10% doing it and drawing it. So like when somebody says, oh, I have this thing and I want you to design it, I think about it while I drink my coffee and read the New York Times, and I think about it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. Sometimes I think about it on the weekend, and I find I do my best work when I get semi-obsessed with things. So, and that's the one thing about our profession that's cool is I love my job. I wouldn't have done anything differently in my career path. There's nothing I would do differently. Even the mistakes I made, I learned from the mistakes. So whenever we get obsessed with things, we tend to do better work. So for me, it's like thinking, design is thinking, research, and design is like the thing at the end, or the drawing is the thing at the end. And when I'm thinking about design, what are we thinking about? The history of the place is really important. Part of that is in our company, we have historic preservation practice that is really symbiotic with the urban design practice. And so their philosophy has really bled into ours. And so I've understood that world, and it's really helped in the design process in terms of the way we think about that. So understanding the history of the place, I think, is important to designing the future of the place. When I'm starting to design, I want to know what's the neighborhood like, what's around it, what informs it. Go to the site if you can. When I was in school here, we didn't have Google Street View or Google Earth, so you kind of had to go to the site. It's interesting now how much you can do without actually going to the site. But if you can't go to the site, usually I find something meaningful about it. This is one thing I feel like people don't talk about a lot. When I start working, especially for like a new client, I want to find out like what's their story, like what's the company or the organization, or if it's a nonprofit, like what's their mission statement, why were they formed, because all that like informs the design. Who are the people involved? This is important actually when you're competing for projects. I'm not saying you should cyber stalk people, but you could find out a lot about somebody who's in a selection panel just by looking online and trying to understand, like, where do they go to school? What are they interested in? Where did they work before they were doing whatever? Where did they live? And so you can kind of use those things to your advantage, and it helps you understand the place better and what their expectations are better. So design, lots of thinking, drawing at the end, at least for me. But where do you find the inspiration for design? This is like an old quote, very cliche maybe, but I think it's very true. I always think good design is almost never random, like almost never. The things that, Doug, you were showing a minute ago with the different irregular and so I don't think that you draw a triangle, but I don't think good design is you drew the triangle because you like triangles. I think that's not good design. I think that you draw the triangle because it was the shape that made when you connected the things that were important around it. Or maybe it had to do with the program of the space and the sun exposure of the space. Maybe that was the shape that came out of it because you're trying to create morning shade and afternoon shade and all this other thing. Or maybe you were trying to pay homage to something that used to be there that's not there anymore, as a way to educate users about something that happened at some time in the past. Or maybe you just drew a triangle because that's the name of the place. So, and that's very literal, but that's also completely not random. So good design is usually almost never random. So when you're finding design inspiration, I kind of touched on these before, but like we look a lot at the history of the site. We look at a lot, how does it relate to what's around it? We look a lot at the microclimate, sun, shade, water, dry, all those things that we love. Who's likely to use the space? How will people use it? Are they be standing? Are they sitting? Where are they sitting? Where are the view sheds? Where does it feel safe to be in the space? And then other similar spaces that work well, and why do they work? One of the biggest things to find inspiration is to look at other projects. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to Field Ops or Escape or Nelson Birdwald's to look, what are they working on? Because I think those firms do really good work. So it is true that if you want a new idea, you read an old book, because nothing is truly, even in songwriting, you're never going to create something nobody's ever done before. You're taking things from the world and making your own version of them and sort of putting them together in a new way. Three of the different pieces of the design process, I'm going to talk about some projects we've been working on and kind of use those to illustrate the point. This is Western Carolina University. It's up in Cullowhee, North Carolina. Beautiful, beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. We were hired to do a $80 million STEM science building. It's now built here. So we were hired to do architecture, landscape architecture, and interiors for this project. So, and this is mostly what I'm talking about is drawing inspiration from the history of the site in this case. So they kind of said, well, here's where we think the site is, because one of the natural science buildings is right there, and one of them is right here, and this is sort of our de facto science campus. So we think that the site is there. But as we always do, we do our research. We realize this is previously Cherokee land. We realized that there was a mound that used to be there that was right next to the site, actually right here, right off the site. It's not there anymore, unfortunately, but it was a Native American mound. And so we pulled some old maps, figured out where it was on the campus, and our site was kind of right there, and then sort of triangulated that to the new campus. We figured out exactly where it was, came back to our site, and it ended up being the complete linchpin of how everything was arranged, including the building. So it ended up being the new building was attaching to part of an existing building. But the entire corridor of the building aligns with this, and so the entire site and the building are sort of celebrating this thing that used to be there that's not there anymore. And so in the Cherokee Nation, eastern band of the Cherokee, the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, are also really important, and so we use that as a lot of the geometries for how to align things, the best way to put it, so I'll come back to that. But basically, now north is that way. It's just an early progress sketch, but we ended up creating this sort of like graded paving pattern that is nodding to that thing that used to be there. And then you can kind of see that in the way it's built. You can see the radiating pattern. It's really subtle, and I think we wanted it to be subtle, but it kind of lets people appreciate something that we destroyed, not we as in our design team, like we as humanity destroyed, that was important. And we talk a lot recently about land acknowledgements in our office, and I think this is a really important. We actually started this whole process with land acknowledgements, like in most of our meetings, just as to give respect to the place. Last thing I'll say about this is, north is like that way. North, south, east, and west are really fundamental to the Cherokee Nation, and so we ended up researching all the ecoregions of this portion of North Carolina, and we assigned, let me go back, each of these zones is like a demonstration area for each of those ecoregions. So the building is done. The green roof is insane, super great, super complicated, most complicated green roof I've ever done in my life, intensive green roof. The quad is about to go to construction, but the building is done. As I said, we're like very non-siloed, and so I love this because we called this the gorge. This is the interior space that looks out over the quad, and it was an abstraction of the gorge, the bluegrass, the Looking Glass Gorge that's up there. But yeah, I mean, we really use local materials. We were really inspired by the craftsmanship of the rubble walls. And so the green roof is really cool. Everybody loves the green roof more than the building, seems like. Not a bad thing to like. So that's an example of finding that design inspiration. The other thing that it's so funny how many of these things that we were talking about in Professor Perdue's class earlier, because one of the things that I think is really important in design is always questioning the scope. It's really, really important, and the best way is for me to give you an example. That's Julia and Sarah, who both from this program, who some of you might know. This is about a year and a half ago. So we were working for Morehouse School of Medicine. They said, hey, we've got all these sidewalks on campus. And I guess the president, like 10 years before, had decided they liked terracotta paint. And so they had painted all these sidewalks with terracotta paint. Well, it gets slippery, and then it's spalling off the concrete and all this stuff. So then they said, well, you're landscape architects. Will you come and look at this and just give us an assessment and write us a spec? They wanted us to write a spec for just replacing the sidewalks. And not only that, but it was just in the small area. Well, if we had taken that assignment at face value from the client, we wouldn't not have an interesting project. The thing about it was the most important space on campus was next door to that. And it was what wanted to be a quad, but was in fact a parking lot. It really wanted to be a quad. And so it took a while and lots of conversation. We finally convinced them, I mean, I know you want to do that, but you really need to rethink this whole thing. Again, it's baby steps, but finally, more talking, we got through to them. It finished pretty recently. This is things aren't grown in, you get it, but it works it's pretty modest, it's pretty flexible, but it really works to really unite the campus. Again, but it wouldn't be a project if we had just said, okay, well, that's the project, the scope is that. Here, another example of this Bank of America Plaza is built in, I think it was completed in 1988. It's the largest building in the Southeast, I think still. But when it was built, it was kind of for any of you who know who John Portman is, he was a Georgia Tech grad, developer, architect. His version of urbanism was the opposite of ours is now. And so his version of urbanism resulted in the skywalks in Minneapolis and the skywalks in Atlanta, taking people off the street because the street was scary, right? So I think it's fascinating, and not because he's a good architect, because it's totally opposite of what we think of now. But this was kind of during that time. And in that time, in Midtown Atlanta, you built a skyscraper, and you wanted to do everything you could to buffer that from the street, because the street, we're not hanging out on the street, right? So, but it was still from that time. But again, the client who we were working on something else, they just said, well, our landscape's overgrown. Can you recommend some other things to plant? That was what they told us to do. And again, it took a while, but we finally convinced them, you need a front door. You can't even see the front door. You have to create the foyer of this place. And so, again, it took a while. Structurally complicated because the entire thing's on top of a parking deck. So trees in the middle, that's why they're not there, not enough soil volume. So these are not great photos because it just finished, but some drone photos of it. And then photos with no people, doesn't look great. But no, I think when it warms up, it's going to be a pretty nice space, and it's you can see the front door. It feels very safe. It's very engaging. It engages Peachtree Street. Would definitely not be a project if we had just said, well, that's the scope. Always question the scope. The design process is messy. I like this quote by Neil Young. He talks about, again, I think songwriting and design are remarkably similar, and it's not like our profession is not one of those where you just you have the idea, in the exact time where you have your studio or the exact time when you're having the meeting. No, it comes when it comes, and you just have to be ready for it. A lot of people draw diagrams like this and talk about this is the design process, it's not linear. I find it to be more kind of like that, and sometimes kind of like that, and more often kind of like that. But you start something, and then you get somewhere, and then you come up with you find some other parameter that you didn't know about, and that sparks an idea, and then you have to go back, which is hard because in our world, this comes up over and over and over and over and over again, especially with architects. These 4 phases, this is like your world when you're writing proposals and things. But it's really like, for us, it's like, this is a cycle. So the design process is messy. And I think, in fact, that is what defines a more design-heavy discipline like landscape architects and architects from engineers, because the engineering process is very non-messy and very linear. Anyway, as an example, this is Camp Twin Lakes. Talked about this with somebody earlier. Camp Twin Lakes, it's the largest special needs camp in the country. They have a site out in the middle of nowhere, beautiful rural pastoral between Atlanta and Augusta in Rutledge, created in the early 90s. They've far since outgrown their camp, and we got hired to create another camp nearby. So they're Camp Twin Lakes, but when we got there, this was maybe 5 years ago, they had created 2 more lakes, so they're actually Camp Quad Lakes. But it was mostly greenfield, beautiful hardwoods, like untouched, not crazy invasive, like really great sort of forest. And we did, 40 site plans iterations. We did for two and a half years, over and over and over again. And so they had this very specific thing they wanted with the cabins. They wanted to cluster them in a way that they would foster team building, like even the way that the doors are situated. But when you're laying out cabins in the woods, like the topography is really important. So you have to align them to the topography, or else you're doing a bunch of grading. So we did all different versions. And by the way, I also mentioned the entire camp is accessible, all of it, even the trails. And there's no handrails. We did a lot, and that was not easy. And so we worked with an arborist, we did the full tree assessment, we did ecological profiles, we did all the things, and then tons of iterations on the site plan, and we get to construction, and that right there, that was where a cabin was going to be. So that's no bueno. So that, it's messy. So we're literally like a day from the concrete truck coming to pour the pads. And one thing about sites like this, we preserved as much as we could, but whenever you're moving dirt around, it changes the hydrology of the site. So what used to be just a little bit wet is now very wet. And so when I saw this, I called our civil engineer and I said, you need to come out here right now. And we came out and very, very quickly had to go back and look at our cabin layout and figure out what we were going to do. So we moved cabins around. I thought they were going to kill me. But it's messy, just messy. And I'm convinced, this is maybe a month ago, I'm convinced it was the right thing to do because it actually resulted in a better design. And just the way, some of these things is like when you get out there and you feel it. This is when you come out of the woods here. It just works so much better. Like you come out and it sort of guides you around. And these are the clusters, like 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. This is where our trail's going to go, accessible trail through. But it's very messy. Again, these are like punch list photos. So this is Georgia red clay, no trees yet. They started going in yesterday, actually. But it's a really, really cool project. Really, really fun to work on, really, really rewarding. So design's messy. I mentioned earlier, storytelling, I think, is just as important as what's on the page. We are storytellers at heart, I believe. And so I'm just as guilty of this as everybody else, but you come up, it's pretty normal that people come up with 3 options: option A, option B, option C. Sometimes it's 4 options, sometimes it's 5 options, sometimes it's just 2. Usually it's not 1, but you can call them option A, option B, and option C. But then you get the client, and they're like, "Well, I like the one with the gable roof that had the door on the other side that was the thing," And they're like, "Which one was that? I don't remember." I think storytelling and branding is super important in design, and just naming things. People remember names. I don't remember option A, option B, and option C. I remember undulated peaks and datum because undulated was a version that was mimicking the topography. Peaks is one that is an extrusion of a pastoral barn that has a hole in it. That's an oculus. And then the third one is a datum, and the datum is the finished floor elevation for all the things that are on the same, and it creates this datum. And so they're like, "Oh yeah, I get that. I remember that. Yeah, I like datum." So storytelling is really, really important, not only in doing design work, but in getting work. This is Oglethorpe University. Beautiful campus, Gothic architecture, 1905, 1910. They have a beautiful quad. It's this gorgeous campus. But we had done some work there, and the trustee, they had a president who was retiring, who had done all this great stuff for the school. He had resolved the budget and gotten them out of this financial crisis. And they're like, "We're going to build this outdoor space to commemorate him." And we're like, "Okay, what are you thinking?" And they were like, "We want to do a water feature right there." I will have a separate conversation with you all about water features. I do not like water features. I think this is time and a place for them. But they're about the opposite of any sustainable design you could ever do, unless you're doing bioretention or whatever. But certainly a time and a place. I like them in a courtyard in New Orleans. Beautiful, great. Not here. So again, it took some convincing, but Sarah Boyer and I were working on this. We were like, I really don't want to draw. I really did not want to come up with a water feature. So we got to come up with something. We just got to come up with something. She was like, "What are you thinking?" I was like, "I don't know. What are you thinking? Do you have any ideas?" She's like, "Well," Sarah was like, "Well, the only thing I know is there's this really cool forest over here, on the edge of the library." I was like, "Okay, let's go over there." So we're here. It's pretty cool. It's like a mix of pines and hardwoods. Really nice trees through there. But interesting, there's no accessible path, which maybe wouldn't be a big deal, but that's the quad, and this over here is all the student housing. So there literally is no accessible path between the quad and student housing without getting in a car or going in the street, which is a major problem. So we tried to kind of spin that. This is the non-accessible path, right? And so the thing that's hard about it is these are all critical root zones of trees, and then you have 30 feet of grade change. So that's tough. And so we went to the trustees, and we were like, "I know you said you wanted a water feature, but there's this really cool space." And they're like, "So you want to build a sidewalk and name it after the president?" We're like, "No." We want to build an experience, and we want to call it Woodland Walk. And it is an accessible path, but that's just by the way. It's an experience. And so we ended up doing this thing, probably the most complicated grading I've ever done in my life. All helical piers, which you can do helical piers, and it only affects a teeny piece of the critical root zone. It's all helical piers, but they love it. And it would certainly not be a project if we had called it a sidewalk. So once we told the story of Woodland Walk, they were all over it. And they were fundraising on it, and they fundraised way more than they thought they were going to fundraise on it. But it was because we told that story. It's pretty cool. Still waiting for the sort of understory to grow in. This is kind of new storytelling. So sometimes you get stuck. Anybody ever heard of Brian Eno? Really? Okay, well, that's work to do. Sometimes sometimes you are working either solo or in a group, and you run out of ideas. It happens on every project. And my colleague Marco, I was talking to him about this recently. He's like, you can't say get stuck. You have to say pivot, because it happens on every project. Get stuck sounds negative, like a negative. He's like, no, it happens on every project. You just have to pivot. I think that I still like saying get stuck because it sounds better, but so I'll put that in for him. But the biggest thing we do is collaborate. So like if I'm working on something and I run out of ideas, I grab somebody, and it's usually ideally somebody not working on the project with me because they're not in it. And I'm like, hey, can you just look at this thing for me? And it is a ton of help. And I also really like asking architects because they also come from a often slightly different point of view. And so I find that really also helpful. But Brian Eno, and there is a point here. Brian Eno, he was a musician. He was first in this band called Roxy Music back in the 70s. And then he made all these ambient records. They're really good working records. Music for Airports is his best one, I think. It's all about how you make an airport, making music that makes people calm down in airports, which is pretty interesting. It's really good working music for designing stuff. But he later became a producer, mostly. He produced like U2 and Coldplay and Talking Heads and Devo and some others I'm forgetting or whatever. But like he ended up being this like really great producer. And so he spends a lot of time in the recording studio with bands, and so he was noticing that like a lot of bands like write in the studio, and he was noticing that a lot of times bands would get to a point where they're running out of ideas. And so he wanted to come up with a way to like spark creative ideas. So him and this guy named Peter Schmidt, this German guy, they came up with this card deck. It's called Oblique Strategies. And the idea was you pull a card and you got to do what's on the card. So like some examples, feedback recordings into an acoustic situation. I love this one. Make an exhaustive list of everything you might do and do the last thing on the list. But I think it's interesting. Oh, look at this. You can kind of blur it. Is it finished? I just think it's interesting as a concept, and like, so it's, by the way, it's a free app. Interesting now. But I kind of pulled some, and what would be applicable to landscape architecture. Use an old idea, work at a different speed, do something boring, make a sudden destructive, unpredictable action, incorporate, use cliches, honor thy error as hidden intention. And I had to think about that for a minute, but my interpretation of honoring thy error is like if you're drawing at your drawing table and you have a cup of coffee and you accidentally make the coffee ring on your drawing, then you have to incorporate the coffee ring into your drawing. That's the point. That's kind of my interpretation of that. Pardon me? Wine, absolutely, wine. So I just think there's this interesting thing about what do you do when you run out of ideas, because you do. I do all the time. Here are some of the things I do. These are not rocket science. I'm sure a lot of people do these. I work in Rhino and SketchUp a lot, and I do lots of hand drawing, and I do Adobe Suite. Those are my tools that I use a lot. When I'm working in 3D and I run out of ideas, I take it out and I draw on it. My favorite thing, especially when I'm doing it in plan view, Ron is nodding because you've done this. You turn the plan upside down, and it forces you to look at it in a totally different way. I do that all the time. I love doing that. Change the scale. So one thing about working in the computer is it forces you to do too much detail too quickly, I think. So changing the scale, whether going, if you're at 10, 20 scale, you take it out, go to 40, 50, 60 scale. It forces you to think about it in a more holistic way, or go outside. Do other people have any of these? I'm really curious about this. Does anybody have any that you've done? Like to spark creative ideas. Are there things? Yes. I mean, what do you do?
Sometimes even in plan view, I like to kind of change my perspective of the drawing, get down real low, kind of like what you're saying.
Oh yeah.
Down, but just
Yeah.
envision it in 3D, even if it's a plan view.
Yeah. Are there other ones? Anybody have any other ones? Yeah.
You alluded to this already, but if you make it a game where you have to design it 5 minutes.
Yes. A friend of mine has this thing. He's a graphic designer, and he does a lot of band flyers, and he does this thing called 5-minute flyers, and he forces himself to do a band flyer in 5 minutes, and you get what you get. He does it for free, but he's like, you get what you get? Yeah. Do you have one? Totally. She said jumping around a lot, and you get inspiration for other things when you're jumping around. Does anybody else have any other one? I think it's interesting, and I've been talking to different people in different design professions about it, and I think I want to add to this list and figure out what the oblique strategies are for the urban designer or landscape architect. I think embracing iteration is really, really important. I saw James Corner speak a couple of years ago at one of the ASLA conferences, and he was talking about this project. I can't even remember the project. It might have been Domino Factory, actually. And he talked about, on every project, it's important to know that not everything you design is going to work, from the first moment. Everything is iterative. I think this is 100% critical with green infrastructure, because there ain't no way to get that right the first time. I don't care how good you are. It is completely iterative. Green infrastructure is iterative. We do a lot of it. This is Trees Atlanta. We called it the Urban Ecology Center at one point, but they kind of call it the Treehouse. I think it's a better name anyway. But this is the new headquarters for Trees Atlanta, a nonprofit organization dedicated to canopy in Atlanta, and educating people on urban stewardship and ecological stewardship. So it's just finishing. They got their certificate of occupancy last week. Alfie is he's the owner's rep of the project. You embarrassed me, so I get to embarrass you. But interesting fun fact is this is a granite outcrop garden that's in the middle of the meadow. This was designed by Daryl Morrison originally. So it was designed, I think, in the early 90s, and it was an ephemeral pool that celebrated the microecology of a granite outcrop, lichens and mosses, and that specific sort of cross-section of ecology. But it was in a pile at the Atlanta History Center because it was ripped out about 10 years ago, and so we had to use old photos, and we had a mason carefully number all the pieces, and anyway, it just finished, but it's really cool. So Trees Atlanta Treehouse, talking about iteration, site plan, it basically is main building, 22,000 square feet, two floors. Implementation building, this is where they do all the dirty stuff, like potting things and getting the watering truck ready and all those things. And then this is the implementation yard. This is the parking area, 100% pervious. This is a site relic. It was originally a commercial bakery called Mom's Bakery that opened in 1958. And then this is a grain silo that you can see we saved. It's kind of a folly in the landscape. It's kind of cool. We saved a giant old southern red oak there. Anyway, so water movement, it was the most complicated thing on this project. I take that back. Budget was the most complicated thing on this project. Water was the second most complicated thing on the project. And there's two sort of layers of that. One is roof capture, and the other is site. So roof, all the roof water gets captured. This roof goes into a pipe here, gets captured on this roof, all goes into a larger pipe here, and goes into three 8,000-gallon cisterns. The site, there's a lot of surface here to absorb. So this goes into a series of under drains, and then it all goes under here, and then into a bioretention system. For those of you who know what forebays are, like forebays are kind of the first cell in a retention or detention system, and they help with filtration. So forebays, like especially when you first build a project, when the runoff comes from the site, it has lots of silt in it. So especially when you first build it, it's really hard for delicate things to grow in that because it just gets hammered with silt. So that is not the place where you put the dainty literal planting, that's down here. You don't want to put that in the first cell. So anyway, that's kind of the way the water works. This is just an old rendering. We ended up doing a culvert here instead of a bridge. But the way it works is it's forebay, and then it's supposed to go in the retention system. So we also had this thing. I feel like all my photos are mud. Spent a lot of time on construction sites. So this here, it's a forebay, but we wanted to create this experience because they have a lot of camps. This experience that you have as like a child of walking across a stream, like with stepping stones, but like big ones, like Blue Ridge Mountain style, like big ones. So they put way too much aggregate in this mix. So I made them excavate a lot of it. This is in process. We picked out some really huge granite boulders, and we put them out there, and it totally dammed up. Totally dammed up. Didn't work. So again, it's very iterative. So we went out there. It rained really hard one night, and I called my colleague Sarah in the morning. I was like, do you want to meet me out at Trees Atlantic? Because I really want to see what the water's doing. She's like, okay, I'll be out there at 9:30, whatever. So we go out there, and it's dammed up. And we're like, oh, man, what are we going to do? So we had them carve these channels out, and then they ended up doing one there and one there. And then about 2 weeks later, it rained like it might have been a 100-year storm. Like it was like serious. Remember this maybe like 2 months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. It was like maybe early December. You probably got it. So it was like hard. And I remember I heard it on the roof of my house, and I woke up in the middle of the night. I was like, I can't wait to see what Trees Atlantic looks like. So we go out there, and it's working awesome. It's working awesome. This is the bottom cell. Again, a lot of mud and clay. It's not grown in. Everything's dormant, but you get it. It's winter. So I was so happy when I got to the site, and this whole thing was full down here because it wasn't before it was dammed up. So a lot of iteration. I don't have photos of the cisterns, but there's a problem with the cisterns too, where the overflows are only 2-inch pipes, and they really need to be 4. And so we got to tweak that with our plumbing engineer. So I think iteration is really, really important. And that's, again, that granite outcrop that fills up. It's pretty cool. This is the meadow. Just while I'm talking about this, we have these 3 drifts of perennials and grasses. I think I know my plants like pretty well, but when we were talking about these with Alfie and with Darren Morrison, I felt like I had no idea what I was talking about because I never heard of most of this. And I love perennials, and so, but it was definitely a learning experience for me. So we had these 3 drifts. It goes from more dry up here. This is 4 feet higher than this over here, which is why this is what allows the pool to fill. So these are the 3 drifts, and we assign each species to a percent within that, and they're plugs. They're 4-inch plugs. They're supposed to be installed in March, I believe. So I think it's gonna be a pretty awesome meadow. I'm almost done. The last thing I wanted to talk about is being a design Swiss Army knife. Brene Brown is kind of a slightly cliche like leadership speaker who I normally wouldn't quote because it's kind of cheesy, but I like the quote. And I think that it's really important for landscape architects to be a design Swiss Army knife. And what I mean by that is I think interdisciplinary collaboration is one of the most important things we do, being able to collaborate with architects, interior designers, geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, civil engineers, and urban planners and urban designers. Because all the really interesting projects have all those pieces in there, and then lots of other ones. But the thing that's cool about our profession is it touches so many things. And so, like, I've shown you different things on different projects. There's green roof, there's green infrastructure, some of it's accessibility stuff. Like, this is sort of, over 20 years of doing this stuff, this is sort of my skill set. What that allows me to do is be the Swiss Army knife, and I come into a project and I just see where's the gap. Where of all these disciplines, where are the things that aren't being filled? So if somebody's a landscape architect and all they want to do is planting design, great. That's not what an urban designer does. You have to be a Swiss Army knife. You got to know about a lot of stuff. And you got to fill those gaps of the different things. And so I just encourage everybody to figure out if you want to be the Swiss Army knife, what is yours? What are yours that you're going to build up? And I said it earlier, but I didn't figure out what I was good at or liked until I did these things. Like, I figured out pretty quickly that recreational design was not going to be my jam, and that resorts weren't for me. I know people that do those and do amazing ones, but I figured out that these are for me. So I encourage everybody to try to be a design Swiss Army knife, and I really appreciate you having me today.